So today I want to talk about the color purple and its connection to royalty. And I wanted to talk about Revelation 17, the scarlet woman with the scarlet beast, and then one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and talked with me, saying to me, "Come, and I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters." Why does she sit on many waters? Because she was dispersed in the diaspora, with whom the kings of the earth committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication. So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, which was full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. So who was in the wilderness? Who was taken out of Egypt into the wilderness? It was the Hebrews. It was Israel, and that became Israel and Judah. And I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, which was full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the filthiness of her fornication. And on her forehead a name was written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots, and of the abominations of the earth. I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I marveled with great amazement. And the angel said to me, "But why do you marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carries her, whom has the 7 heads and the 10 horns. The beast that you saw was and is not, and will ascend out of the bottomless pit and go to perdition. And those who dwell on the earth will marvel, whose names are not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they see the beast, which is a king, that was and is not and yet is. And here is the mind that has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. There are also 7 kings, 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other has not yet come. And when he comes, he must continue a short time. The beast that was and is not is himself also the 8th, and is of the 7th, and is going to perdition." So there's a lot to this scripture, and I just want to cover the topic today of the colors of purple and scarlet, which is also known as crimson, and also the cup, the gold cup in her hand. I want to cover some of the history of the purple dye of the temple and of the kings of Judah and Israel. In Lamentations, we're told that the royalty of Israel, that they were raised on purple and scarlet. And this was before the Romans started adapting that for all of their emperors. The Times of Israel reported this story: purple from the Holy Temple objects traced to snail guts at 3,000-year-old Haifa factory. Archaeologists uncover new evidence at a Phoenician dye factory that suggests the site was conquered by Israelites around the mid-9th century. The scarlet, purple, and sapphire hues that adorned curtains and robes at the Holy Temple in Jerusalem likely came from the sea snails processed at a 3,000-year-old dye factory in modern-day Haifa. Archaeologists recently announced, after discovering new evidence at the Tel Shikmona site. The new research suggests the Israelites may have conquered the factory from the Phoenicians to obtain more access to the expensive purple dye and create wealth for the growing empire. An article describing it between Israel and Phoenicia, the Iron II A through B Fortified Purple Dye Production Center at Tel Shikmona was published earlier this month in the peer-reviewed Journal of the Institute of Archaeology of Tel Aviv University. The purple dye is created from a gland found in 3 kinds of sea snails, commonly called rock snails or murex, found along Israel's coast. The dye likely created both the argiman purple and techelet blue referred to in the Hebrew Bible. The color is so strong that it can stay fixed for thousands of years, meaning dyed fibers from 3,000 years ago maintain their vibrant hue. Depending on how long the purple color was exposed to the sun during the production process, the color of the dye can range from bright bluish green to a deep purplish red. This color of purple never fades, and the technology that enables the dyeing of fibers was probably invented in the Levant, though people usually ascribe it to Lebanese Phoenicians, said Professor Eilat Gilboa of the University of Haifa, who led the study with Dr. Golan Shalvi, a research fellow in the Zinman Institute of Archaeology in the University of Haifa. Purple is traditionally considered the color of royalty because of the expense of creating the dye from these sea snails. It was used for the curtain of the Holy Ark in the temple, and the elite were wearing clothing that incorporated purple fibers that included the high priests, the king, and really anyone who had the money, said Gilboa. The purple dye is often referred to as Tyrian purple because it is thought to have originated in the Phoenician seaside city of Tyre in modern-day Lebanon. Its production was one of the major economic engines for the Phoenician. Tyre is about 50 kilometers or 30 miles north of Haifa and 50 miles south of Beirut. Roman historian Vitruvius expounded on the color in his opus, 10 books on architecture, published around 27 BCE, around 1,000 years after the Tel Shikmona factory had already been in production. So they had this color in Israel, in the Phoenicia area, and then the Romans got a hold of the dye. And he says, I shall now speak of purple, which above all other colors has a delightful effect, not less from its rarity than from its excellence. It is procured from the marine shell, which yields the scarlet dye, and possesses qualities not less extraordinary than those of any other body whatsoever. It does not, in all places where it is found, possess the same quality of color, but varies in that respect according to the sun's course. A factory destroyed and rebuilt. The dye factory is located in Tel Shikmona on the southern end of Haifa's coast. The settlement remains have previously confounded archaeologists. It was first settled in the Bronze Age around 1500 BCE, but was quite small compared to other settlements at the time. It was also located far from agricultural lands and next to an area of rocky coast that was unlikely to be useful for maritime trade. Dr. Yosef Elgvish first excavated the site in the 1960s and 70s and discovered large ceramic vats that were dyed purple and a large amount of Phoenician pottery. He proposed that the site had some role in the production of the purple dye, but didn't delve into the amount of production or who ran the dye process. More recent excavations over the past 5 years, led by archaeologists Gilboa and Shalvi, who is also a postdoctorate fellow at Ben Gurion University, found evidence of Israelite settlement that led them to believe that the site was conquered by the Kingdom of Israel around the mid-9th century BCE, around the time the biblical king Ahab ascended the throne. The dye factory was destroyed and rebuilt. The archaeologists found Phoenician pottery from after the rebuild, showing that Phoenicians were likely still living there. They also uncovered Israelite-style fortified walls, Israelite seals, and four-room houses that were common to Israelite architecture at the time. These discoveries, combined with historical texts and understanding about the geopolitical situation at the time, led them to hypothesize that the site was under Israelite rule, but Phoenicians still carried out the day-to-day labor. You really need to be a person who understands the sea, and this is knowledge that is passed through generations much earlier than Israelites came into power, said Shelby. Israelites are people of the interior of the highlands, not of the sea. The color of money, and this color was one of the most commercially expensive things available and really created a lot of wealth, Salvi explained. This is also a color that has a historical and holy meaning for the Jews. He noted that several historical accounts from this period mention the kingdom of Israel's military and economic strength, but these excavations illustrate concretely how the kingdom was able to identify an economic opportunity as it expanded northwards and monopolize it for local production. It enlarges our understanding of the picture from the practical perspective and helps explain how the Israelites achieved this level of economic strength. This is the best place along the Israeli coast with the best habitat for the MUREX snails that produce the dye, said Gilboa. Here, the Carmel Ridge continues into the sea, so the surface of the rocks underwater is quite high, and it's very easy to access the shells. The true purple dye and its associated azure techelet variant are mentioned dozens of times in the Hebrew Bible and Sennacherib Cylinder, 690 BCE, among other texts. True purple is associated with royalty and the priesthood, as well as textiles used in the tabernacle and the temple. And you shall make a dividing curtain of blue, purple, and crimson wool, and twisted fine linen. The work of a master weaver he shall make it, in a woven cherubim design. From Exodus 26:30 through 31. In 2021, Israeli researchers announced the discovery of 3 textile scraps near the southern tip of Israel, colored with the biblically described royal purple dye, and dated them to 1000 BCE, the era of King David. These purple fibers are currently the oldest known example of the purple dye discovered in Israel, as the discoveries from Tel Shikmona date to a few centuries later. The dye is created from 3 types of sea snails found on this Israeli coast: the spiny dye murex, Murex brandaris, banded dye murex, which is Murex trunculus, and red-mouthed rockshell Murex hamastoma. And the banded dye murex is the most plentiful and accounted for the majority of the dye, Gilboa said. A special exhibit at the Bible Lands Museum in Jerusalem in 2018, called Out of the Blue, exhibited some of the Murex trunculus snail shells excavated at the Tel Shikmona site. The holes in these shells show where the gland from the snail was extracted, with each yielding only a minuscule amount of the rare and highly coveted pigment. Each gland produces less than a gram of dye, so for a single kilogram of dye, thousands or even tens of thousands of snails are needed. Some experts from the Tel Teklet organization, which produces tallit fringes from the MUREX, believed that the dye was worth up to 20 times its weight in gold. This place was very active and very productive, said Gilboa. Shikmona is the only place that we know where it was not a village producing small amounts of dye, but the whole site was a factory. There may have been another reason for the lack of residences in the area, one that modern Haifa residents know all too well, an intolerable stench from the factory. Phoenicians in general have always excelled all nations, and by the export of purple-dyed manufactures, the Tyrian purple being in the highest estimation, wrote Strabo, the Greek geographer and historian who lived from 64 BCE to 21 CE. The shellfish from which it is procured is caught near the coast, and the Tyrians have in great abundance other requisites for dyeing. The great number of dyeing works renders the city unpleasant at a place of residence, but the superior skill of the people in the practice of this art is a source of its wealth. So we know that the prophet Daniel was a prince of Judah, and it is written that when he was taken off to Babylon in Daniel 5:29, then Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple. A gold chain was placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. So he was of the royal lineage of the tribe of Judah, and he was clothed in purple with the gold chain. And then we see in Daniel 5:7, it says, and this talking about Nebuchadnezzar, it says, the king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and soothsayers. And the king spake and said to the wise men of Babylon, whoever shall read this writing and show me the interpretation thereof shall be clothed with scarlet, and have a chain of gold about his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. And the New King James Version, that was King James. The other version says, the king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. The king spoke, saying to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and tells me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck, and he shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. So there we have an interpretation of being clothed with the purple and being clothed with the scarlet. And of course, Daniel was the royalty from Jerusalem, and he was the one who was able to interpret the writing. So he was clothed with the purple, the scarlet, and so let's look at some other things. So it was the royalty of Jerusalem, the monarchy, that wore these colors. So the fact that Jesus, Yeshua, was from the tribe of Judah, and he was the King Messiah of Israel, of Judah, the rightful heir to the throne. This is why the Romans were mocking the Jewish King Jesus as the King of Israel in Jerusalem on God's holy mountain. And we see in Mark 15, starting at verse 9, but Pilate answered them, saying, will ye that I release unto you the King of the Jews? For he knew that the chief priests had delivered him for envy. But the chief priest moved the people that he should rather release Barabbas unto them. And Pilate answered and said again unto them, what will ye then that I shall do unto him, whom you call King of the Jews? So he was the royalty. He was the King of Israel, the King of the Jews, King of Judah. And they cried out again, crucify him. Then Pilate said unto them, why, what evil hath he done? And they cried out the more exceedingly, crucify him. And so Pilate, willing to content the people, released Barabbas unto them, and delivered Jesus when he had scourged him to be crucified. And the soldiers led him away into the hall called Praetorium, and they called together the whole band, and they clothed him with purple, and plaited a crown of thorns and put it about his head, and began to salute him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they smote him on the head with a reed, and did spit on him, and bowing their knee, worshipped him. And when they had mocked him, they took off the purple from him, and put on his own clothes on him, and led him out to crucify him. So the reason why they were putting the purple, the scarlet robe, on King Jesus is because he was the king of the Jewish people. He was the royalty of Jerusalem. So they were mocking that. And of course, the Romans who were trying to replace Israel, they were copying what they were doing by wearing purple and scarlet, with the Caesars claiming themselves to be gods and all of that. But that came later. So we actually see that the robe was purple in Mark 15:17, that they put on King Jesus in Jerusalem, the royalty. But in Matthew 27:28, it says that they stripped off Jesus' clothes and put a scarlet robe on him. And we see that in Matthew 27:27. Then the soldiers of the governor, Pilate, took Jesus into the praetorium and gathered the whole garrison around him. And they stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him. When they had twisted a crown of thorns, they put it on his head, and a reed in his right hand, which is supposed to be mocking the royal scepter and mocking his power and authority, because you receive the scepter and the crown when you are anointed as the anointed king. So they were mocking him for that. And they bowed the knee before him and mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they spat on him and took the reed and struck him on the head. So they were taking the royal scepter and beating him with it. And when they had mocked him, they took the robe off of him and put on his own clothes on him, and led him away to be crucified. Now, a lot of you already know about Ron Wyatt's story of finding the Ark of the Covenant and the crack that was an earthquake crack, and the blood supposedly went down there and landed on the lid of the Ark. Now, there was an excavation that was done after Ron Wyatt died, and one of my followers on my channel, interestingly enough, contacted me, and I asked him about this situation, and he told me that they did a later excavation with it was Richard Reeves, who was running the Wyatt Museum, and his son had a program on TBN. I don't know if he's still on there or not, because I don't watch it, but when they did this excavation looking for this blood that was supposedly on, you know, the cave walls, when they went where Ron said that it was, they made the comment that they didn't find anything there, but they did find some MUREX shells. And when I heard that, I was like, oh my gosh, that's the MUREX for the purple royal dye and the scarlet dye. And also there's the crimson worm, which I talked about in detail, about how they obtain that from the Toliot Shani worm. And they get that off the cactus pads. So it's really a fascinating story. I did a whole study on it and made a video or two about that. But you see here that it's written that this robe that was elaborate, that was put on King Jesus of the tribe of Judah, which pinpoints exactly that the royal lineage in Jerusalem wore purple and scarlet. Then what you have here is the Tyrian purple, because it has this shade variant from very deep purple to the range of, well, it can go into the green shade, but it can go into the scarlet shade. So it's kind of a combination of both. Somewhere in between is, the preferred royal color. Now, it was later on that the Romans adopted this Tyrian purple. Did the Roman emperors wear red or purple? Its striking color and resistance to fading made clothing dyed with Tyrian purple highly desirable, and the ancient Romans adopted purple as a symbol of imperial authority and status. So it was a copycat type of situation where they were trying to replace the people in Israel and their temple, and that's why later on they set up the Vatican, and of course the Vatican is wearing purple and scarlet. So it's a copycat situation there. And we saw in Revelation 17:4 about the scarlet harlot, the woman wore purple and scarlet clothing and beautiful jewelry made of gold and precious stones and pearls. And of course she held a golden cup in her hand. And purple is a crimson or purple dye that is related to indigo and was obtained by the ancient Greeks and Romans from gastropod mollusks and is now made synthetically. The city of Tyre flourished for much of the first millennium BC, thanks in part to the lucrative trade in Tyrian purple. And that's a quote from Mark Woolmer of the National Geographic in 2020. So sought after was the color, which eventually became the only shade in which priests and kings, emperors and magistrates would enrobe themselves. Elaborate origin myths emerged to explain the dye's predestined discovery. The higher your social and political rank, the more extracted mollusk dye you could swaddle yourself in. According to the Roman historian King Ptolemy of Mauritania's sartorial decision to cloak himself in purple on a visit to the emperor Caligula cost Ptolemy his life. Caligula interpreted the fashion statement as an act of imperial aggression and had his guest killed. Purple, it seemed, was also to die for. It was customary in Old Master depictions of the heavenly host and of Mary and Christ the Messiah himself, who was described in the book of Mark as laden by his tormentors with purple clothes, and also scarlet, lampooning his supposed status as king of the Jews to transfer the raiments of royal authority to those taking charge of the hereafter. When seen through the lens of the dye's unsavory forging, the purple robe that seems forever to be slipping from the suspended physique of Messiah in Michelangelo's dramatic fresco, The Last Judgment, which troubles the walls of the Vatican Sistine Chapel, can be understood as another tawdry layer of worldly trappings that the Messiah's second coming overcomes. And this is the image of a purified humanity coming out of its compromised shell. Now, the BBC also adds to this in their January 29th, 2021 report that said, Israeli archaeologists find biblical royal purple dye. A purple dye dating back to the purported reign of the biblical King David has been identified on a piece of fabric by Israeli archaeologists. The dye is said to have been more valuable than gold and was associated with royalty. It is the first time textile from that period with the color has been found in the region. Israeli Antiquities Authority expert Dr. Naima Sukenik called it a very exciting, important discovery. In antiquity, purple attire was associated with the nobility, with priests, and of course with royalty. The gorgeous shade of the purple, the fact that it does not fade, and the difficulty in producing the dye, which is found in minute quantities in the body of mollusks, all made it the most highly valued of the dyes, which often costs more than gold. Purple is mentioned in the Jewish and Christian Bibles, including in garments worn by King David and King Solomon and Jesus. The material containing the dye was found during a dig at a site known as Slaves Hill. The color immediately attracted our attention, but we found it hard to believe that we had found true purple from such an ancient period, said Professor Eretz Ben Yosef from Tel Aviv University's Archaeology Department. Until now, the color had been found on mollusk shells and fragments of pottery, but not on dyed fabrics. Carbon dating of the fragment found it came from about 1000 BC, around the time when King David is said to have reigned, followed by his son Solomon. And you want to know what's really weird about this is that my mother always loved to wear purple sweaters, and they were actually this exact same color. She loved to wear jewel tones, and purple was one of her favorite colors to wear. And so I wore this because I was going to be talking about the purple dye. But let's see, the Israeli Antiquities Authority posted this picture of this true royal purple that they discovered from the time of King David. So isn't that an incredible discovery? Seeing this purple dye from the time of King David? And if that was discovered there in Israel, dating to King David, then how do we know that this piece of fabric did not come from the king himself? I mean, it stands to reason, doesn't it? So when we see Jerusalem as Mystery Babylon, the mother of harlots, in the book of Revelation, and we see the king placed back on the throne, then, she was dressed in purple and scarlet, and this is the Tyrian purple of the royalty. So, as I told you, it shows, a beast that died by a deadly wound, a sword in the head, and the head is the head of state of the monarchy. And that's what I try to get people to realize, but they're not making the connection. They just keep thinking these other renditions that they've always heard. But the king is the head of state. So it was one of the heads of the ancient monarchy that was wounded to death when the Lord brought the sword against them. And and now in the last days, as I said, they're going to reestablish a king on that throne. So that in Jerusalem is the place where the purple and scarlet were, with the royalty of Judah and the kings that reigned in succession there. As I said, King Jesus was dressed in that color in mockery. The purple with the scarlet, that's the Tyrian purple of the royalty. Tyrian purple is also known as royal purple, imperial purple, and imperial dye. And it is a reddish purple natural dye. So it's a scarlet purple. And Jesus' robe was of this dye. The name Tyrian refers to Tyre of Lebanon. It's secreted by several species of the predatory sea snails in the family MUREXidae, rock snails originally known by the name MUREX. In the ancient times, extracting this dye involved tens of thousands of snails and substantial labor, and as a result, the dye was highly prized and valued. Now, let me just talk about another writing of this same story about an ancient cloth with Bible's purple dye found in Israel, dated to King David's era. And this was posted January 28th of 2021 in the Times of Israel. And it says 3 scraps from 1000 BCE, earliest find in the region, point to Edomite kingdom described in Bible. Vibrant and lasting royal dye, mark of the elite, comes from the Murex sea snails. Israeli researchers have found 3 textile scraps near the southern tip of Israel colored with the biblically described royal purple dye and dated them to circa 1000 BCE, the era of King David, the earliest ever such finds in this region. So let's look at these 3 specimens that date to Royal King David and Royal King Solomon. Vibrant cloths add tangible weight, in particular to the Bible's account of an Edomite kingdom in the area at that time. Colored with the most precious dye of the ancient world, the textile scraps were excavated in the Timnah Valley near Eilat and offer startling new insight into an ancient elite class. The tiny, vibrantly colored Iron Age cloth pieces are the earliest evidence of this precious dye in the entire southern Levant and shed new light on the early Edomite kingdom and Israelite kingdoms 3,000 years ago, a period when the Bible details the conquering of the Edomites by King David. Also called true or Tyrian purple, the vibrant, millennia-lasting color is produced by those dye glands gathered from 3 species of the live Murex sea snails on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. To reach the famed King Solomon copper mines in Timnah, near the shore of the Red Sea, the cloth would have traveled hundreds of kilometers, which only added to its prestige and value. It's a very early period to find true purple in use, and it's a very strange location, Tel Aviv professor Eretz Ben Yosef told the Times of Israel. It's deep in the desert where we didn't traditionally think these prestigious materials were in use. The discovery, he said, offers additional evidence for our new understanding of nomadic people at that time period, and at the time of the emergence of these ancient kingdoms of Israel, Edom, Moab, Ammon, and the local kingdoms of the biblical time. The true purple dye and its associated techelet or azure blue variant, created through the variant processing of the snail's dye, are mentioned dozens of times in the Hebrew Bible and in the circa 690 BCE Sennacherib cylinder, along with other texts. The true purple is associated with royalty in the priesthood, as well as textiles used in the tabernacle and Jewish temple. The cloth and the Murex snails themselves were given an in-depth hands-on study in new interdisciplinary collaborative research paper published this week by the prestigious PLO's One scientific journal. The investigation took the researchers from field excavations of Timna to Israeli university laboratories to fish markets in Milano and Palermo, Sicily. Until now, the earliest textile evidence of the royal purple dye were dated to at least 1,000 years later in the Roman period, when it was highly valued. So see, it was there in Jerusalem way before the Romans were taking it to use. The paper, Early Evidence of Royal Purple Dyed Textile from Timna Valley, Israel, was co-authored by Naima Sukenik from the Israel Antiquities Authority and Ben Yosef in collaboration with Professor Zohar Amar, Dr. David Iluz, and Dr. Alexander Varvak from Bar-Ilan University, and the IAA's Dr. Orbit Shamir. Ben Yosef explained that Timna is the first and foremost known for its copper, which was mined by ancient land of Israel dwellers as early as the 5th millennia BCE, going all the way to the early Islamic period some 1400 years ago. Even recently, he said, the nascent state of Israel had a small factory that produced copper there. The dry climate conditions at Timna, deep in the Arava desert, allow for the unusually good preservation of organic materials, similar to the much later Roman-era textile and leather finds discovered in the Judean caves and at Masada. What is noteworthy in Timna, said Ben Yosef, is that the big story is related to the early Iron Age. We're talking about the 11th to the 9th century BCE, and it is a very debated period in the history of the land, the period attributed to the rise of the biblical kingdoms of Judah and Israel. Alongside the remnants of the textiles and other indications of relatively luxurious conditions, the picture painted after continued excavations is changing the view of the nomadic Edomite, said Ben Yosef. We see it as the early Edomite kingdom versus a mere tribal camp. With Timna's arid desert, we find stuff that you usually don't find in regular excavations, such as textiles, ropes, leather, things that usually decay and are not preserved, said Ben Yosef. So we have a unique window into the people of the region at that very early period through these amazing and unique organic materials. We have dozens and dozens of fragments of textiles, ropes, cordage, basketry, and things that usually you don't find. Sukenik, the IAA's curator of organic finds, told the Times of Israel that every year the collaborative research group takes a trip to the Timna site to access and marvel at the extremely rare ancient finds. And remember, I said that they're marveling after the beast in Revelation, and a beast is a king, so they're marveling after this royal dye that the kings wore. In Jerusalem, the new finds were located in Slaves Hill, arguably the largest copper smelting camp in the valley, which the team has excavated for the past 6 years. While excavating, the archaeologists discovered tiny pieces of textiles of many types emerging from the ground. Some were derived from rough tent coverings, some from sacks, and some from the pieces were brightly colored. Sukenik said the team noted the brilliant purple peeking out on 3 of the many scraps of textiles excavated that year. We saw a few pieces in which the shade was really special. We really wanted it to be true purple, the most expensive dye in the ancient textile industry, he said. The textile pieces were taken back to the Bar-Ilan University laboratory, where it was confirmed these molecules unique to the MUREX sea snails, which produce the true purple dye, were discovered on the cloth scraps after high-pressure liquid chromatography analysis, which is used to identify organic dye stuff. According to the paper, identifying the organic dye colorants in the archaeological textiles is a complex task due to the low concentration of the molecules in the fibers and the limited amount of material available for destructive analysis. Hitting upon this result was a Sisyphean task, he said, and required very intensive work. Upon learning that the dye was indeed the ancient true purple, personally it made me really happy She said that a trove of ancient MUREX trunculus snail shells were recently excavated at the Tel Shikmona site in northern Israel, dating back to the 10th through 7th centuries BCE. Being organic material, one of the Timna cloth pieces was also sent for radiocarbon-14 testing at a laboratory in Oxford, where the date of 1000 BCE was calculated. If we were to peek into David and Solomon's closet, we'd see similar clothing, and perhaps even more true purple. During the early Iron Age, we already knew that there was a true purple textile industry, she said, but until now, there had been no dyed textiles according to the paper. The first archaeological evidence for use of the dye dates from the 19th century BCE in the form of murex snails. I'm so happy that Eretz Ben Yosef gave us the opportunity to peek into the clothes closet from the period of David and Solomon and see the wardrobe of the elite that lived in the period at the copper mines, she said. I suppose that if we were to peek into David and Solomon's closet, we would see similar clothing and perhaps even more of this true purple. Discovering that the 3,000-year-old textile scraps were dyed with royal purple was only one step of the journey undertaken by this ambitious research project. Another chapter not recorded in the PLOS, one paper, saw Bar Ilan University professor Zohar Amar visit the fish markets of Italy to conduct experiments on the 3 species of snail. The 3 species of snail were endangered in Israel, and Amar told the Times of Israel that he couldn't obtain enough samples to truly conduct his experiments. So he took himself to Milano, which holds the largest fish market in Europe. There, the snails are eaten as part of the varied Italian diet, and 2 of the species, spiny-dyed murex, which is Murex brandaris, and banded dye murex, which is Murex trunculus, are plentifully traded in the market. And what's really special about this to me is that a place that I used to work years ago, we sold seashells, and the Murex trunculus was one of the shells that we would sell. And at the time, I had no idea the connection to the purple dye that was the royal dye of the monarchy of Israel. Amar rented a laboratory and hired local staff to conduct hundreds of experiments on thousands of snails. Each snail's dye gland, he said, only holds a minuscule amount, circa 1 gram, so he ordered a massive supply, which arrived in special refrigerators that kept the snails fresh and alive. Even in ancient texts, such as the writings of Roman author Pliny the Elder and the Jewish Talmud, it was emphasized that the snail glands be procured fresh, which creates the best dye, Amar said. Having used dried glands that were shipped to Israel in some experiments, he can now vouch for the value of fresh specimens. The glands were traditionally dried in the sun, but Amar imported an oven from Israel to speed up the process. It was very hard work, very stinky, he said, much like working in a fresh fish market, he said. The Italian fishermen who delivered the snails thought it was a bit crazy. What they ate, I threw away, and what they threw away, I used, he laughed. 2,000 years ago, the rabbis discussed how impure creatures, such as the sea snails, forbidden from an observant Jewish diet, could be the source of a dye used in such sacred spaces as the tabernacle and temple. Amar answered that through his experimentation with the snails, he realized that nothing of the meat of the snail remains through the chemical processing of the snail glands into dye. The material turns into something else. While 2 of the species were in plentiful supply, locating the 3rd species saw Amar take out the big guns, his Italian mother-in-law. With her help, the 3rd species, red-mouthed rockshell murex, Hemastoma was sourced in Palermo, Sicily. He traveled to the Mediterranean's largest island, only to be disappointed when inclement weather caused the fishermen to come back with a catch only after a subsequent trip could he successfully harvest the third snail's dye glands. Although Amar had studied the theory behind the preparation of the true purple and associated azure, or the blue dyes, in conducting in the practical work, I learned a lot about the historical sources. It was like time tunnel to the past. He conducted his initial experiments barehanded, only to discover that the dye that lasts millennia on archaeological artifacts quickly stained his hands blue for weeks. He said that it gave insight to a Gemara passage that had always mystified him. The Gemara relates that when priests go in front of the congregation to give the traditional blessing, the priestly blessing, they cannot have discolored hands. And if they do, it is only permissible for them to give the blessing if the entire congregation is likewise dyed. After walking around with blue hands for a couple of weeks, he understood just how distracting people found it. When I returned home on the plane, I had to hide my hands, he laughed. So I'm going to have to divide this video into two pieces, but I want to finish up with this because there's little time left on my battery. I want you to hear this in 2 Samuel 1:24. Daughters of Israel, weep for Saul, who clothed you in scarlet and finery, who adorned your garments with ornaments of gold. Let me read the rest of it together with that. This was 2 Samuel 1, verse 24. Listen to this carefully. O daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you in scarlet with luxury, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. How the mighty have fallen in the midst of the battle. Jonathan was slain in your high places. I'm distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. You've been very pleasant to me. Your love to me was wonderful, surpassing the love of women. How the mighty have fallen, and the weapons of war perished. So in Revelation, we see the daughters of Israel that were clothed in scarlet, and they were raised in purple, which I'll show you in another verse, but they've fallen in the midst of battle. And this was Saul, and they're going to put another King Saul on the throne, an earthly man, and reestablish the Davidic dynasty without acknowledging King Jesus Yeshua as their king. Let it soak in. O daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you in scarlet with luxury, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. Now I want you to hear this. In Lamentations 4, when they were being hauled off to Babylon, this is what Jeremiah wrote in Lamentations as they were mourning. Those who ate delicacies are desolate in the streets. Those who were brought up in scarlet embrace ash heaps. The punishment of the iniquity of the daughter of my people is greater than the punishment of the sin of Sodom, which was overthrown in a moment with no hand to help her. So Jerusalem is the scarlet harlot. She was raised on the purple, the royal Tyrian purple, and it was scarlet and purple dye, and the royalty wore it. And all of her delicacies were thrown in the streets. All of her gold was no longer shining. It was hauled away to Babylon. So, Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots, the scarlet harlot, is Jerusalem, the ancient monarchy of Israel and her people. And there she is, resurrected in the book of Revelation. So she was, then she was not, and now she is in the last days. Another version of that verse in Lamentations 4:5 says, those who once ate delicacies are destitute in the streets. Those brought up in royal purple now lie on ash heaps. So this was the scarlet harlot, Jerusalem, and all of the royalty was taken away, and God brought a sword against the ancient monarchy. That's the deadly wound of the head of state, the king, that was no more.